Okay, welcome everybody. Folks are still joining. We'll give everyone 1 or 2 more minutes and we will get started very shortly. All right, all. We are going to get started right now. Just want to remind everyone that you can put your questions in the Q&A box and we will do our best to answer them. We'll have some time at the end to go through some of those. So, welcome everybody. We're very happy to have you here for our final public meeting for the Western Avenue Corridor Study. It's been a great community effort and we're excited to share the draft results and get some feedback. So we're here today to share what those draft strategies and recommendations for implementation look like, and also invite some additional feedback so we can refine the draft study before it's adopted at the Chicago Plan Commission later this year, hopefully, and then review next steps. So we'll do a brief welcome and overview for the first 15 minutes. We'll give a 30-minute presentation on the study recommendations, and then we'll end with 15 minutes of next steps and Q&A. We want to try to do this within an hour. We can't talk about the entire study. It's over 18 months worth of work, so we're not going to cover all the details today, and we encourage folks to check out the study on our website and then also fill out the survey, and I'll talk more about all of those things very shortly. So as a reminder, we're talking about the Western Avenue corridor between Addison and Howard Streets, which is 5 miles long, the northernmost 5 miles of this street in Chicago, and goes through 4 wards and 9 neighborhoods. So the ultimate deliverable for this is this long-term vision document, which we have a draft for online. It includes policy recommendations for land use development and infrastructure and identifies opportunity areas for public realm, transit and mobility, and neighborhood development improvements. Finally, and most importantly, there's an implementation strategy associated with that to be able to implement things in the short and long term. This is a study that's led by both the Department of Planning and Development as well as the Department of Transportation, DPD and CDOT, has been heavily informed by stakeholders, residents, businesses. And we have the assistance of a consultant team led by SITE, who is also on this meeting today and may help answer some questions later on. We could not have done this without our steering committee. We had some really great members and excellent support and participation from our steering committee. This includes city departments and sister agencies, elected officials, neighborhood organizations, chambers of commerce, and then finally advocacy and expert groups. We have done quite a bit of community engagement over the past 18 months or so. We've had several meetings, working meetings, workshops. We've had steering committee meetings, focus group meetings on both topics and geographies. We also had a youth council and had several meetings with them. We've also had now 4 public virtual events like this one. We've had a youth-led pop-up event in Northtown Library, and now we currently have an exhibit up in Northtown Library that I will also encourage you to visit. And then you may have heard about this study from the various other ways that we have tried to get into contact with you, with postcards, bus stop ads, surveys, flyers, social media, all of that. So we began this process in early 2021. That's when we kicked off. And we had our kickoff meeting and had some topical focus groups shortly after that, where we really dug into topics like housing or transportation. Then last year, we then came up with some principles, strategies, and concepts to discuss. And we had 2 public meetings on that, one in the northern half of the corridor with a focus on that area, and one with a focus on the southern half of the corridor. At the beginning of this year, we had location-based focus groups where we talked about specific areas on the corridor. And then finally, here we are at our final public meeting, and we are targeting November 17th for adoption of this study at the Chicago Plan Commission. So before we dive into any actual material here, just to remind everyone, our participation principles that we discuss in all of our meetings, we are all collectively agreeing to these as we participate. The first is we will be transparent by sharing relevant information, ideas, and concerns with one another. We will seek inclusion by listening to as many voices as possible while embracing productive tensions and respectful disagreements. And we will communicate in good faith and a spirit of collaboration and mutual respect. Then we will envision the long-term future grounded in data-driven and feasible strategies. We will create a collective vision for Western Avenue that acknowledges the diverse conditions of the entire 5-mile corridor from Addison to Howard. And we will develop a cohesive long-term roadmap that is the first of many steps towards change. Implementation will entail future projects with their own processes. So this is not the last word on any particular thing. At this point, I'm very excited to introduce Commissioner Maurice Cox from the Department of Planning and Development to say a few words to kick us off.
Thank you, Catherine. Well, it's great to be here with you for what is the final meeting on the Western Avenue Corridor Study, and what we expect will serve as a planning tool for commercial corridors citywide. In many ways, I think the northern portion of Western Avenue is kind of like a microcosm of a lot of the issues and the opportunities that are shared by many streets throughout Chicago. So on behalf of Mayor Lightfoot, I just want to thank everyone for participating, for strategizing with us, and for setting such a high bar for what's really an unprecedented process that we hope will replicate on behalf of other city neighborhoods in the months to come. The study would have been impossible to undertake without the incredible partnership, first and foremost, of the area Alderman Silverstein, Vasquez, Martin, and Haddon. Thank you for your leadership in trying to imagine what the future of this vitally important corridor in your ward should be. As Catherine mentioned, the Chambers of Commerce have been incredibly helpful in making connections and giving us real input on the future of the street, and the many neighborhood groups that have participated. And there have been a lot of stakeholders and area residents who provided their time, their insights, their vision about what the current status of Western is, and more importantly, what they feel the future role it can and should play as a main street for literally tens of thousands of people. So your collective work has made this essential, and it's essential to the evolution of the corridor long term. And I think it demonstrates the city's commitment to some core principles. equity and resiliency are at the core of this. There are also two principles that anchor the We Will Chicago citywide plan. I think it demonstrates our commitment to public transit and the goals that are part of the recently adopted Connected Communities and TOD, ETOD ordinance. And I think it expresses our support for a fundamental concept of the 15-minute neighborhood, where every resident is just steps away from the urban amenities that all Chicagoans expect, deserve, and makes our neighborhoods worth living in. It is, without question, an ambitious study with a lot of innovative strategies that I think represent some of the best possible practices to improve on the existing conditions. But it's also pretty easy to comprehend. And you'll see from the illustrations in terms of some of the main themes that are lifted up, like more public transit options, more walkability and pedestrian orientation, more economic activity, more housing for a mix of incomes and households, and more public realm improvements that reflect, I think, the unique and welcoming character of the local neighborhoods that Western Avenue touches. So we have a lot to cover tonight, so I'll close with final thanks to our lead planner, Catherine Hurd, and everyone who's assembled here online. Just thank you for your commitment to the future of Western Avenue, to your neighborhood, and most importantly, to the city of Chicago. So enjoy the evening. We look forward to your input. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. So some of our aldermanic partners would like to say a few words before I do the rest of the presentation. So we have a representative from Alderman Vasquez's office because he is on vacation, a well-deserved vacation. So Morgan, would you like to say a few words on behalf of the 40th Ward?
Hi, everyone. I'm Morgan. I'm the Director of Development at the 40th Ward office, and I'm representing Alder Vasquez tonight. We're so proud of all the stakeholders in our community that came together and got to work on a collaborative vision for Western. Through community and stakeholder participation, it's become clear we all share the same goals: building more affordable housing, implementing bus rapid transit on Western Avenue, creating vibrant neighborhood centers and safer streets for all. We are committed to continuing collaborative work with our stakeholders to make the vision a reality for the communities along our corridor. We've had great success with community planning through our work on the Lincoln Avenue Streetscape, Ainsley Arts Plaza, and through projects implementing pedestrian and cyclist infrastructure. Alder Vasquez is fond of saying, "The government is yours," as a way of emphasizing the vital role of the community voice in governmental decisions. We are so very excited to continue our work together to build a city that works for everyone. Many thanks, especially to you, Catherine, who have been incredible to work with throughout this process. As a budding urban planner myself, I've been in awe every step of the way by the work Catherine has done to engage stakeholders and build a plans centered on our collective vision. I'm excited to see where we go from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Morgan. That was very sweet. Alderman Martin, would you like to say a few words as well?
Would. Thank you, Catherine. As Morgan and Commissioner Cox mentioned, just so incredibly appreciative for your and the broader team's work in shepherding this very important, very timely project to its end stages. Since I've been in office over the last 3.5 years, a number of things that we've heard around the Western Avenue corridor, things that this plan is intending to tackle head on, one being pedestrian safety. We have a number of schools on Western, whether it's Lane Tech or other schools very nearby. And so pedestrian safety is always top of mind for folks as they're crossing streets like, hi, well, thank you. Like Western, as well as Irving Park and some other nearby streets. So the fact that this is getting such close attention with a specific focus on nodes where we see folks most active as they're walking to and from home, school, and businesses is so critical. We're also really excited about the prospect for improving transit along Western Avenue. We recently passed an equitable transit-oriented development ordinance, and other TOD work predating that is really premised on the idea that we'll continue seeing significant improvement, hopefully not just around L and Metro, but also along buses. So the prospect of bringing bus rapid transit to broad swaths of Western Avenue, not just in this area, but all across the city, is incredibly important. It's timely and it's exciting, to be quite honest, given the fact that, among other things, we have serious environmental challenges that we need to tackle. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more feedback from residents during this meeting, seeing plans finalized with the Plan Commission, and ultimately putting as much of this into practice as quickly as possible. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alderman. And we are going in ward number order. So Kyle, do you want to speak on behalf of the 49th Ward and Alderwoman Haddon? And then we'll finish up with Alderman Silverstein, last but not least.
Thanks, Catherine. Appreciate you inviting us to this, and look forward to continuing our work on this important project. My name is Kyle Ryan. I'm the Manager of Economic Development for the 49th Ward. Alderwoman Haddon apologizes for not being here tonight. She sends her regards, and all of us here at the 49th Ward want to recognize the great work that DPD has been doing on this project. As an urban planner myself, I know all the hard work that Catherine has put into this over the last 18 months. It does take a lot of effort, collaboration, and blood, sweat, and tears really to make a plan like this work. So we really appreciate all the work that you've been doing, Catherine, and your team. I want to thank all the community partners that have been so very involved in this, and all the great feedback from both the chambers, our other community partners, and constituents along the corridor. And a special shout out to Alderman Silverstein for really spearheading all of this and shepherding this plan to make sure we have a well thought out plan for one of the busiest corridors in the entire city. So as the northern little section of the corridor, we're happy to see it move forward, and we look forward to working with you guys more. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. And as Kyle mentioned, Alderman Silverstein is who we can thank for this study happening. She was the initiator of this, so I think it's only appropriate to give her the last word before we dive into the recommendations.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for being here today. I'm really excited about this study. As was mentioned, Western Avenue is really important to me, and for many reasons, we need more economic development, at least in the 50th Ward. We need to make it safer. It's such a busy street that we need to make sure that pedestrian safety is there, and that we're keeping everybody safe. And it would have been great if I had a TIF that had $20 million in, and we could have just done this major streetscape, but we don't here. So I turned to Commissioner Cox, and I asked him to get his team involved, to help with this study, and then to turn the results of the study into a reality. So like you've heard from my colleagues, Catherine Hurd has been absolutely phenomenal. I want to thank the commissioner and Catherine personally for all of the hard work that you've done. And it's not over. As I just said, we got to turn this vision into a reality. So you're not done yet. We've had some great ideas, thanks to everybody that's been involved. So thank you to everyone who has participated. And I am done. So I'm going to turn it back over to Catherine. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much,
Yeah,
Alderman.
thank you.
All right, so we'll do about a 30-minute presentation about what's in the document. We encourage everybody to go and review it in detail for themselves for whatever topics you are most interested in. And we'll also talk about how to give us some feedback as well. So very early on in this process, we talked about what our overarching themes and principles and goals are. And some of the three that came to the surface were envisioning a corridor with thriving places, safe and attractive streets, and resilient communities. So what we mean by that is when we say thriving places, We want to find areas where we can concentrate density and mixed use activity, more foot traffic, commercial activity in strategic areas where that commercial activity can be more successful. In between those hubs, we want to make sure that we are activating underutilized properties and storefronts, which also means that we should be looking at how we can repurpose or infill housing in there. And then, as was alluded to earlier by Commissioner Cox, locating most of our daily destinations within a 15-minute walk from neighborhoods along the corridor is critical to having more livable neighborhoods. So some of the strategies associated with accomplishing that are to really support higher density mixed use within these central neighborhood centers, and increasing the range and types of affordability levels for housing, both on and near the corridor. It's also very important that we are focusing on protecting our naturally occurring affordable housing, and that's certainly been an issue in some of the neighborhoods along the corridor. To create a really vibrant public realm, to knit this all together, we have a placemaking toolkit where we are in different areas of the corridor implementing these in different ways to enhance the pedestrian environment, activate sidewalks, install public art, allow for community programming, and creating new public spaces. Within the public realm, we can also activate that better with our buildings by, if we're building a new building, sending it back off from the sidewalk a little bit to create a little more sidewalk space, activating and upgrading our underutilized storefronts. And at this point, I will pass this over to Ellen Schmidt, who is my counterpart, the project manager at CDOT.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Catherine. My name is Ellen Schmidt. I'm the Assistant Project Director for the Livable Streets Group at CDOT, and we have been assisting with this project. As Catherine mentioned, safe and attractive streets is a key component of this plan. So some of the items that we've looked at along Western include establishing a bus transit priority infrastructure. Western Avenue is one of the highest bus ridership corridors in the city. So we feel this is a key component to the plan and something that we heard very strongly from the public. So that is a very important piece for us moving forward. In addition to supporting transit here, we also want to continue to support Western Avenue as a strategic regional arterial. And what that means is this is a key corridor in the city that's been identified to move goods, move people, and that is really kind of the key function of Western Avenue and will continue to be a key function of the street as we move forward, as we're making all these other improvements. Even though it is a strategic regional arterial, we still have plenty of room to improve the pedestrian safety and pedestrian comfort along the corridor as well. So we'll be looking at pedestrian safety improvements, particularly at the intersections and traffic calming throughout the corridor to help lower speeds and just make this a more comfortable space for pedestrians to traverse and spend time in. And we also want to look at the bike network in this area. With Western Avenue being a strategic regional arterial with a lot of truck traffic, a lot of bus traffic, this is not an ideal place for cyclists. So we really want to focus on enhancing the east-west connections that already exist that cross Western Avenue, making those easier for cyclists to traverse, and also helping to direct people to some lower stress alternatives that can help people travel north-south in this area. And this kind of zooms in on some of those ideas that we discussed in the first slide. So here you see kind of a blown up version of kind of a mock block that we envision for Western Avenue. So you'll see we've got an intersection improvement toolkit. So these are the items that we would implement to do some of those safety improvements that I discussed in the previous slide. We want to encourage multimodal mobility hubs and cluster multiple forms of transit into one area, making it easier for people to transfer and change modes of travel. And as I discussed on the last slide, bus priority infrastructure is also very important. That can include things such as bus bulbs, bus lanes, and enhanced bus stops. And then also we want to expand the pedestrian space to create a more walkable corridor, and also to shorten crossings with bump outs and refuge islands to provide additional safety for pedestrians. And on the aesthetic side, we're looking to improve the appearance and also the performance of the urban landscape with increased street trees and green infrastructure. Adding more greenery to the corridor was something really important that we heard from the community again and again throughout the study. And we also want to clarify and enforce curb management restrictions for street parking, loading, and ride sharing zones to make the street function a little bit better for everyone. And improve the bike network. As I mentioned on the last slide, with connections and navigation and wayfinding to help people find their way from one bike connection to the next. And we'll also be looking to optimize timing of the traffic signals for bus travel and also to help prioritize pedestrians at the intersections.
Thank you very much, Ellen. Our final of the 3 themes is resilient communities. And what we mean by that is that we want both environmental resilience, so what often people think about when you talk about sustainability and resilience, but also economic resilience and sociocultural resilience as well. So how we want to talk about that is we are supporting these systems within each of those 3 categories of resilience: environmental, sociocultural, and economic. There are a series of indicators that are things that can be measured. So we collectively can measure these things, can monitor how different impacts are changing them, improving or making them worse, and we can use those indicators to help guide us to fine tune as we go. We have a series of strategies which have just been described sort of in 3 basic buckets: public realm design, an equitable land use framework, and a multimodal transportation network. And so we want to make sure that as we're implementing things, we are paying attention to how those impact our neighborhood resilience, so that we can course correct as needed as we go, because this is a long-term framework. We don't want this to just be our plan for the next 1 to 5 years. We want this to continue to guide us for many years to come. So before I dive into the next section, just a reminder, you can put all your questions in the Q&A box and we will address those at the end. So please, as you have questions, you don't need to hang on to them. You can just put them in the box and we'll hang on to them for later. So I want to talk briefly about the land use framework. We mentioned earlier about neighborhood centers, of creating these mixed use neighborhood centers. And there are a few basic ingredients for how we define that. So one is that you have a higher density mixed use core. So these are the highest density of the corridor, most likely. There's also a convergence of reliable and multimodal transit service, institutional and commercial uses. So things like schools, libraries, doctor's offices, markets, restaurants, pharmacies, within that neighborhood center, all tied together with an active public realm. So that is a public realm that is welcoming. It's designed to be comfortable, convenient, accessible for all ages and abilities. And then very importantly, to create these 15-minute neighborhoods, we need a variety of affordability and housing unit types within a 15-minute walk of these neighborhood centers. So given that these are sort of the ingredients of a neighborhood center, we identified 5 of these along the corridor. And we have more information about all 5 of these in the actual document. I'll talk a little bit about them, but I won't go into all the detail because there's much more there. So From these 5 neighborhood centers, we translated that into our land use framework. And again, this is, a long corridor. This is kind of small. You can see it in much more detail in the report document itself. But you can see that there are 3 types of land use being identified here. One is the neighborhood center, which we just talked about, that was identified in that previous map. The other one in yellow is housing infill. So you'll see there's a lot of that. So these are areas where we've identified a lot of opportunities to increase housing. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then you'll see 2 areas that are this pinkish color that's called commercial transition. I'll describe that shortly as well. So the neighborhood center, we talked about that briefly, but these are our hubs of mixed use activity. Each one of these land use categories has recommended uses, density, and zoning types. So within this one, we want active ground floors, we want housing above the ground floor, maybe office above the ground floor. This is going to be the highest density of the corridor, which we're recommending between 3 to 4 FAR, which stands for floor area ratio, the ratio between the built floor area and the site area. It's a way that we can measure bulk and density. So these are our highest density moments along the corridor. And then we have zoning that aligns with those recommendations for uses and density. Then the housing infill segment. So these are areas where we want to increase housing and there are opportunities. These are often areas that have vacancy right now that are transitioning in land uses, but there are still, some good amenities there and some good connections to the neighborhood to build on to really complete a neighborhood. So within these areas, obviously residential uses, housing uses are very important. Some smaller scale neighborhood serving commercial uses like a coffee shop or a laundromat on the ground floor and like higher pedestrian areas. But much of it, we think, of the new development can be residential all the way to the ground floor. And even for some of the storefronts that are being underutilized right now, we have some guidelines around how you might be able to convert those to be ground floor housing. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then finally, our commercial transition segment. So this is a segment type that most of the corridor used to be, and now because of these transitions in the land use, there are just smaller pockets of them and we can sort of concentrate those a bit. So these are our dominant commercial areas. These are often more vehicular dominated. So less pedestrian activity, less housing. And so we want to try to concentrate those together, those types of uses together, while still supporting the overall land use framework. So we want to see commercial uses at the ground floor, potentially office or residential above. And then these are a little lower density than the neighborhood centers with lowest density sort of in between the areas where with more pedestrian activity, higher density at the corners and the intersections where there's more pedestrian activity, and then the zoning that goes along with it. So those 3 types have been applied throughout the corridor. You'll also notice that there's not a hard line between any of these. We want this to be flexible as the years change, and the boundaries might shift slightly over the years. And so we want to make sure that this can be flexible as we go. So the most important thing, we want to talk about implementation. There's a lot more in the document itself about this, but I want to talk about the neighborhood center implementation first. So these are the 5 neighborhood centers that were identified. Each of them, the areas around them, we've identified a series of recommendations. We also have corridor-wide recommendations, and those are outlined in detail in the report as well, but we'll just talk about the location-specific ones right now. So I won't talk about all 5 of them, so it would take all night, but we can talk about one. I'll show you a sample of what is in there, and then for the neighborhood center locations that you're most interested in, hopefully this gives you some navigation so you can dive in a little bit deeper later on. So this first one is Lincoln Square. This is, roughly where Lawrence meets Western. This is the spread from the actual report. So for each of these neighborhood centers, we identify what the primary zoning is there today. Any relevant districts like Lincoln Square SSA is in this district, the special service area. And then there's also a TIF district in this area that expires in 2024, which will be relevant when we talk about some of the near-term recommendations. We also have some of the existing conditions and community priorities findings. These came out of our analysis and our community engagement, particularly the location-specific focus groups that we had more recently. There's also opportunity sites, and I'll talk about that in the next slide in more detail, because that's a sort of separate thing. We have a locator map of where this neighborhood center is in relation to the rest of the corridor. We've identified character buildings that are important to the unique neighborhood character for these areas. And then we also have on these maps the existing transportation infrastructure that's relevant. So to talk about the opportunity sites, I first want to define what that means. These are sites that we expect may be redeveloped in the future. And so based on our experience in other areas or even along this corridor, we believe that if a site meets one of the three following criteria, we should be prepared for the fact that it could very well be redeveloped and have some thoughts about how we would want to recommend a redevelopment would happen should that happen. I want to be clear that in almost every case, we do not own or control these sites, and we don't know what's going to happen or have any control over that. We just want to be prepared in the situation where that does happen. So the criteria that we think make them more likely to be redeveloped and we need to have some sort of plan for are that the current use is incompatible with the long-term future vision of the area, or the current structure is incompatible, or the site is otherwise underutilized. So it's vacant, or it has much less square footage than is allowed there. So you'll notice that there are several opportunity sites defined here. For each opportunity site, we have the address, what the existing use is, the approximate site area, and what the zoning is today. And you'll see that there are two priority opportunity sites. So we have a few of those that are important gateway sites. And so this is an important gateway right at Lawrence, where we have a little bit more information on those, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. So this is the actual recommendations component where we've identified areas where we want to do the intersection improvements, where the bus priority area is being investigated, where we're reinforcing the interconnected open spaces, where there's placemaking opportunities. And then of course, we have some sample massing development blocks in here. So should these projects develop, this is approximately what it might look like if it follows the rules of the land use framework and the design guidelines. So with each of these, there is a near-term action items table that talks about what's going to be happening soon and when, if we know. So there are three categories. There's the public realm and infrastructure. And you'll notice that many of these things need to be done by the end of 2024 because that is when the TIF expires, and the TIF district is paying for many of these improvements. So there are quite a few things that are in the hopper right now that will be installed and there and ready to use by the end of 2024, which is going to be here before we know it. There's also some additional studies and practices that are recommended in here. And then for the land use and development, if we have any affordable housing projects that are in the works, that's a near term, like if we have a schedule for that. In this area, there is one affordable housing project that is expected to be completed around the end of 2024. But then we also have recommendations around starting to use this study and the recommendations and guidelines from the study in evaluating projects that are happening. And we've already sort of started to do that, but we want to formalize that process. And then with programming and activation, we want to make sure that, excuse me, we are partnering with our Chamber of Commerce, aldermanic, and neighborhood organizations so that they are able to start using this space and activating it and getting the momentum going. This is one of those, sorry, this is one of those sample priority opportunity sites where we sort of demonstrate how the design guidelines would play out in a specific site, a sample site, this one being the Fifth Third Bank at Lawrence and Western. So as I mentioned, the design guidelines are also part of this. And how we talk about these is that they are in addition to whatever the required zoning is, and other guidelines, such as the neighborhood design guidelines, which are applicable to all neighborhood commercial corridors in the city of Chicago. They're a good foundational set of urban design guidelines. So these guidelines are meant to build onto that, to give inspiration, identify best practice examples for the types of projects we expect along the corridor, and then give us something to help review those proposed projects as they happen. So there's a few different categories. One is for the adaptive reuse for existing historic buildings. There has been quite a lot of interest in preserving the character of these historic buildings, and there's definitely some very interesting ones along the corridor that we don't want to lose. So we have some recommendations around renovation and reuse, so how to spruce up a storefront, how to reactivate a historic building. And then also, as mentioned, we're going to look at ground floor conversion of storefront to residential units. And so we have some examples and guidelines around that as well. Then for new construction, we recommend prioritizing underutilized sites like the identified opportunity sites for new construction, so that we're not going after and tearing down our naturally occurring affordable housing. So we want to target those underutilized sites first. So when we're doing mixed use development, we want active ground floors, interesting relationship with the public realm, providing vitality to the street. And then for our housing infill segments, where we have residential uses all the way to the ground floor, not just on the upper floors, we want to make sure that there is an appropriate buffer between the front door of the building and the sidewalk to provide a little bit of landscape relief, both for the pedestrians, they have some more greenery around them, maybe some extra shade trees, but also to provide a little separation and privacy for the residents of those buildings. Excuse me. All right, so in order to do this, it's going to take all of us working together. So it will truly take a village. We will need to continue working as a team, keeping up this momentum for the long term. The primary implementers here that have been most involved in actually forming the recommendations, figuring out the implementation strategy are the alderpersons, the city departments and sister agencies, and the chambers of commerce and the special service area operators. And then we've had strong support and will continue to need strong support from our neighborhood organizations, advocacy organizations, and all of the neighbors and local business owners. So there's a lot to the implementation part of this that we want people to take a look at. But just at a very high level, there are sort of 4 basic components that we need to use the study's recommendations for. The first is to identify and allocate resources for projects based on the study's recommendations. So we know what the projects are now. Now we need to figure out how we're going to pay for them and how we're going to prioritize things based on those recommendations. We want to pilot innovative policies and projects along the corridor, and then we want to evaluate how those impacts, what those impacts are to refine and expand what's working. Then we want to use the study recommendations and guidelines to evaluate and advocate for projects. So as projects are happening, or as there are projects we want to see happen, we want to use these recommendations and guidelines to help us as a tool. And then finally, we want to promote these development opportunities to folks so that we can start getting the ball rolling with getting some more economic development and some more activity along the corridor in strategic locations. So very quickly before we open up to our Q&A, I wanted to talk about what the next steps are. So right now, The draft report is available for review. We want to hear your comments. We have a survey that's open that's linked there as well. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. We are targeting November 17th for the Chicago Plan Commission adoption. And we are already starting, but we'll kick up the energy once we've got this plan adopted to get to work on the implementation. And we need everyone's help to get that moving. So the survey is live now. If you go to chicago.gov/Western, it's on the front page, the draft report and the survey. There are 5 topics that the survey covers: the community engagement process, the planning themes and goals, land use and development recommendations, mobility and public realm recommendations, and then finally the study's application and use. There are only 8 multiple choice questions those are the only ones that are required. And it's about your level of agreement with certain statements. And then there's also 6 optional free response fields where you can give us additional feedback, and you can just write it out. We think it'll probably take around 5 minutes to complete, and it closes October 31st because we want to make sure we have time before we adopt the study to actually include and integrate all of those comments and feedback. If you're not that into reading a document, but you are interested in looking at an exhibit, we have an exhibit now at the Northtown Library, which I believe is also going to be an early polling location for voting. So if you vote there, you should check it out. So you can actually see some of it from outside. So the big high-level strategies can be seen from outside on the plaza on Western Avenue at Northtown Library. And then if you go inside, there's more information on each of the neighborhood centers there as well. So before we kick off to Q&A, if there's anything more that you want to say after the survey is closed, or in addition to the survey, you can always email us at westernave@cityofchicago.org. You should always be following up on chicago.gov/Western to see what the latest is, and then you can sign up for our email updates then as well. So at this point, would love to start looking at some questions. Gabby from DPD is going to help field those.
Yeah, so thank you, Catherine. That was a really great overview. And we have lots of questions. So please, if you have any more that are coming, please put them into the Q&A box, and we'll try to cover at least most of the themes that we're seeing. So one of the first questions that came in was, has the study considered using Reconnecting Communities funding to implement these recommendations?
So Ellen, can you field that one? Do we lose Ellen?
Sorry, I'm here. I'm not actually familiar with that specific grant funding. We'll certainly be looking at all different sources of funds. As Catherine mentioned, quite a bit of this will be funded with TIF. And we'll also be working with some of our partners. We'll be working with the aldermen. We'll be working with local SSAs and chambers of commerce. So, the ability to secure grants and things like that for this work is definitely something that we'll be looking into. And thank you for bringing this particular grant to our attention.
Yes, thank you. And to clarify, this is part of the U.S. Department of Transportation's one of those programs. So another one here is, this is a great question. What can neighbors do to help implement the plan recommendations?
Yeah, that is a really great question. I love that question. That's great. So one of the things that would be really helpful is, show up when there are community meetings, when there are surveys asking for your feedback, when there are projects or proposals happening. We want you to show up and provide support. So write an email to your alderman, send an email to to us over at DPD. Like we want to hear from you, and your voice really does matter. We read all of those and we record all of them. And so having your support is always very helpful to keep things moving. You can also so that's as projects are happening. You can also proactively advocate for things that you would like to see that align with the study recommendations. So you can always bring those up to your local alderman. You can bring them up to CDOT, to DPD. We're always excited to talk about new opportunities, but your role is really to provide the support, to get your neighbors involved, to get local businesses involved, so that we can all get sort of the community will to get things moving.
Great, thank you. So there's a number of questions about bus rapid transit or BRT. So one of the first ones that came in said, it's essential that bus rapid transit be prioritized on the Western Avenue corridor, but not just along this stretch, but for its entirety. Is BRT being considered for the entire length of Western?
Yes, so I do kind of want to speak kind of broadly about BRT. I know there's a lot of questions in here. So that is something we've discussed as part of this project and something that we've heard support for. Studying Western for BRT is something that's beyond the scope of this larger planning project. And it would require an additional study to be piloted with CDOT and CTA. And we would be looking at all of Western Avenue beyond the limits of this 5-mile stretch of Western to determine the place that would be the most effective to implement BRT. So we will absolutely be looking outside of this boundary when we do those studies.
Great. So to recap, there are further studies needed to understand exactly how this would be implemented, and that's kind of mentioned earlier in the plan as well, that a number of these ideas still need further study to actually make happen. Right, Catherine?
Yeah, so there will need to be, a technical engineering analysis to figure out, what a cross section would be that would work. There would need to be an analysis to figure out, what are the extents of this? Because as Ellen mentioned, it doesn't make sense for it just to be this northernmost 5 miles of Western. Like that wouldn't, I mean, maybe, but probably not, would not be that helpful. So yeah, there just needs to be this larger discussion, and that is in our near-term action items of things that we need to do, is get that conversation moving so that we can get that study on the road.
And then I would also add, BRT can look a lot of different ways. It can be a dedicated lane. It can be something like what was discussed for some of the previous BRT plans in Chicago, or it can be a series of smaller items that get implemented. It doesn't always have to mean, an entire dedicated bus route. And that's something that would be studied between the CDOT and CTA to determine what could work best here. And that would all be done with an extensive public process so that the community would be engaged throughout and would get to weigh in on what those improvements might look like.
Yeah, and I'll just, there's been more questions about how BRT is out of the scope. And as I mentioned, the technical analysis and the geography well south of Addison is definitely beyond the scope of this planning study. But what has become very, very clear through our community engagement and has been documented in this study and has been sort of taken in by our communities is that there needs to be more bus priority on Western Avenue to get transit moving faster. And the intention and sort of the political will around moving things forward with BRT is absolutely part of the scope of this study, and we are actively working on that.
Great. Another question says, taxpayer resources have been committed to developing the placemaking toolkit. What statutory mechanisms are in place or in the works that would ensure the toolkit is used? Is it opt-in suggestion only, or does it require DPD or the Chicago Plan Commission to review it?
Ellen, you want to take that one on the kind of public realm improvement toolkit?
Sure. So some of the recommendations that have been found in the study, CDOT's already beginning to look at some of those recommendations and where where everything is feasible and where funds are available, those improvements will be implemented. And some improvements along this 5-mile stretch are already in the works and being designed now, kind of based on some of the feedback that we've received with funding that is available today. So really, it just comes down to having those specific engineering designs and studies to ensure that what we're proposing is appropriate for the area and will improve safety, and making sure that funding is available.
Great. So another good question. Is there an explicit goal to reduce noise pollution along Western? I support more housing along Western. I'm concerned with quality of life for residents along a busy arterial.
Yeah, definitely. And that's something that we spent a lot of time talking about, is if we're going to make this equitable transit-oriented corridor that's going to have more robust transit and also a lot more activity and people living on the corridor, that it needs to be more more friendly to pedestrians and certainly less hostile than it is right now. And the noise pollution, the kind of fumes, the fast traffic, all of those things are impediments to wanting to live directly on Western Avenue, and particularly on the ground floor, which is why these recommendations for the transportation, for the public realm, and for development are all critical. They fit together. So you're not going to have success in one of them without doing some of, or at least not full success in one of them without implementing some of the others. So for example, for ground floor housing, we have recommendations for the design guidelines so that there is a landscape buffer. It's set back from the street a little bit so that you have some additional landscape trees, shrubs to attenuate some of the noise, and also give you more privacy. Also, having a more generous tree-lined public realm with more greenery also help absorb some noise and some of the fumes from the vehicles. And then finally, on the transportation side of, trying to slow down traffic so that it's not speeding through really fast, being very loud, encouraging a transition to electric vehicles, transitioning to more transit, so it's fewer individual vehicles on the road. All of those things kind of fit together to make it more appealing to live on Western Avenue.
Great. I think this is a good question just in general. How will we attract retail to this section in, when the trends are moving towards online sales and that type of thing? So we just want to mention some of the tools available.
Yeah, and that was obviously also a big part of the impetus of this study, is that there is increasing vacancy in many portions of the corridor, and there's this transition from a more auto-centric and much more commercial dominated types of land uses and development types along the corridor. That is changing because the nature of commerce and the way that we live and what we do on a daily basis has changed over the decades. And so, at one point, the city of Chicago had, miles and miles of, commercial lined corridors, and that is just not the case anymore. We can't sustain 5 whole miles of continuous ground floor commercial. That just isn't realistic in today's day and age. So what the strategy is to be able to concentrate that commercial activity where it will be most successful. And so we want to concentrate around those neighborhood centers where there's going to be more density, there will be more people, there will be more pedestrians moving through there, and there will be other types of commercial and institutional uses, public amenities that are all clustered together to attract people to be there, which will then better support the businesses and also the neighborhoods as a whole.
Great. And do you want to mention, I mean, there's ability to layer different types of DPD programs on top of these things?
Oh, yeah. So are you referencing the Small Business Improvement
Yeah, like
Fund?
the SPIF and NOF.
Yeah.
funds.
NOF does not apply on Western Avenue, but for Western Avenue, I believe North and South, Western Avenue North and Western Avenue South TIFs will be having Small Business Improvement Fund openings. So please visit the DPD website and look up Small Business Improvement Fund, affectionately called SPIF. And that is a program that can support small businesses to fix up, storefronts and do some other capital improvements to your space. And that is funded through the TIF district.
Great. So the question here, what alternate north-south routes will be suggested for bikes? And what will be done to ensure that the route is safe for bikes, in all of those directions and things? So broadly kind of addressing some of the bike safety concerns.
Sure. So we are, CDOT is currently improving the bike network every day, and we're always on the lookout for other alternatives and missing connection points within the current bike infrastructure. For this area, we're looking at Lincoln Avenue as a bike lane alternative. We're expecting to have bike lanes installed in that area soon, as well as we have the existing river trail within this area. And we're also studying some alternate greenway spaces for more of a quiet neighborhood connector that could be a little bit lower stress to help people travel north-south by bike.
So Gabby, let's do one final question. We are just slightly over 7, but I want to make sure we cover at least one more because there are a lot of questions. We will follow up on the website afterwards with an FAQ. So we will gather sort of the common themes in the questions. There is an FAQ, the frequently asked questions from our kickoff meeting that's already on there, and maybe some of your questions are answered there, but any questions on the recommendations, we will gather those and put up a frequently asked questions shortly after the meeting. So Gabby, last question.
Is there one that you wanted to cover specifically, or I'm just trying to catch up here on what we have? We talked a lot about the safety and the street changes that may happen. Like this one is how much rezoning will be necessary to implement the plan? Can rezoning requests from a developer be conditioned on conformance with the plan?
Yeah, so that's a good question, an important part of the implementation. So if a developer is proposing a zoning change, we want them to have to comply with the recommendations of the plan. So they need to refer to the land use framework and see where does their site or the use they're trying to locate fit within that land use framework in terms of the uses and the densities, and then referencing the design guidelines. If they need a zoning change, typically they need to go to the alderman's office, and we are working with the alderman to kind of have a process so that when the aldermen receive a project, they will share this study because it will exist and it will be easy to share so that others can review it, so that everyone is clear on what the expectations are, but then also involving the planning department, involving any affected chambers of commerce or neighborhood groups, so that as we are reviewing these projects, we are referring back to this document before the alderman will then move the project forward so that they can get a zoning change at city council.
Great, thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, again, thank you all so much for your participation. Please, please, please fill out the survey. Again, chicago.gov/Western is our website, and the draft and survey are there. We look forward to hearing from you, and have a wonderful evening.